June 6, 1944. 6 kilometers off the coast of Normandy, the sea is doing something no tank was ever designed to survive. Force 4 winds are dragging 3-metre swells across the Baie de la Seine, and in the gray half-light before dawn, 32 Sherman tanks are about to be lowered into the water. Not landed on a beach. Lowered into open water, expected to swim the rest of the way in. Each one looks absurd. A canvas screen, waist-high, rises around the hull like the collar of a coat 2 sizes too large, held up by 36 rubber tubes filled with compressed air. Behind the turret, 2 small propellers churn the water, geared off the tank's own engine. From a distance, through the sea spray and the smoke of naval bombardment, they resemble nothing so much as small boats. That is rather the point. Up close, they are 700 yards from Omaha Beach with the ramps of their landing craft dropped, engines straining, canvas walls the only thing between 30 tons of steel and the bottom of the English Channel. Within minutes, 27 of those 32 tanks will be gone. This is the story of the duplex-drive Sherman, the tank that was meant to walk on water and arrive on the beaches of Normandy ahead of the infantry, its guns already firing, its crews already dry. It very nearly worked. In places, it worked brilliantly. At Omaha Beach, on the worst morning of the entire invasion, it became one of the costliest miscalculations of the Second World War, and men who had trained for months to fight on land instead fought for their lives in water that was never meant to be their battlefield at all. Why does a tank need to swim in the first place? The answer lies in the arithmetic of an amphibious assault, and it is brutal arithmetic. Planners staring at the problem of Normandy in 1943 understood something simple and terrifying, that the first wave of infantry to touch any defended beach would be walking into machine gun fire, mortars and obstacles with no armored support of any kind, because tanks could not simply drive off a landing craft into deep water and expect to survive the attempt, let alone fight afterwards. The lesson had already been paid for in blood. At Dieppe in August 1942, Churchill tanks had struggled onto shingle beaches under direct fire, many of them thrown tracks or bogged down within meters of the surf, unable to advance, unable to retreat, reduced to stationary pillboxes for German gunners to pick apart at leisure. Of the 58 tanks landed at Dieppe, not one made it off the beach and back to England. The raid cost nearly 900 Canadian lives in a single morning, and the tanks that were supposed to protect the infantry instead became some of the first casualties of the operation. The problem, stripped to its essentials, was this. Infantry needed armored support the instant they hit the sand, not 20 minutes later once engineers had cleared a path and landing craft had queued to unload. But no existing vessel could put a 30-ton tank directly onto a beach without exposing both the craft and its cargo to point-blank fire during the run-in. Standard landing craft, tank vessels, the LCTs, were themselves enormous targets, slow, difficult to maneuver, and utterly dependent on reaching the shoreline before they could unload anything at all. If the Germans sank or stalled the LCTs offshore, as they very nearly did in several sectors on D-Day, the tanks inside them were worthless, trapped below decks in a burning hulk. Beyond Dieppe, there was the wider lesson of the Pacific and Mediterranean landings that Allied planners had already studied closely by 1943. At Salerno and Anzio, tanks had come ashore only after infantry had already been fighting, sometimes for hours, against defended positions with nothing heavier than a rifle or a mortar for support. Casualty rates in those opening waves were consistently, brutally higher than in later phases of the same operations, once armor had finally been brought to bear. The pattern held everywhere it was tested. Whichever side put steel on the beach first tended to win the opening exchange, and whichever side waited for steel to arrive tended to pay for that weight in bodies. Overlord, the code name for the Normandy invasion, was going to be the largest amphibious assault in human history, and the planners at Combined Operations Headquarters in London understood, with grim clarity, that the same pattern would repeat itself unless something changed. There was a further complication specific to Normandy. Allied planners knew, from photographic reconnaissance and intelligence gathered by the French resistance, that the beaches were seeded with obstacles designed explicitly to wreck landing craft at various states of the tide: steel hedgehogs, Belgian gates, wooden stakes tipped with mines, an entire engineering discipline devoted to making the final 100 meters of any assault as costly as possible. Getting large, slow vessels close enough to disgorge armor directly onto dry sand was, in many sectors, simply not going to happen without catastrophic losses before a single tank tread touched land. What the invasion needed, then, was something that did not yet exist anywhere in the world: a battle tank capable of launching from several thousand meters offshore, propelling itself through open water under its own power, and arriving on the beach ready to fight within moments, its gun already loaded, its crew unharmed by the crossing. On paper, this sounded like science fiction. A Sherman tank weighed over 30 tons and had the buoyancy characteristics of, unsurprisingly, a very large block of steel. Making it float was not a modification. It was closer to alchemy. The man tasked with performing that alchemy was Nicholas Straussler, a Hungarian-born engineer working in Britain, and the organization that would test, refine, and ultimately deploy his invention was Major General Percy Hobart's 79th Armored Division, a unit that existed for precisely this purpose: to take ordinary tanks and turn them into something the enemy had never encountered. The tanks that emerged from Hobart's workshops earned a collective nickname among the men who used them: Hobart's Funnies, and the duplex-drive Sherman, or DD for short, was among the strangest and most consequential of the lot. Straussler's solution was, in essence, embarrassingly simple once you saw it work, and fiendishly difficult to get right in practice. Rather than trying to make the tank itself buoyant, which was impossible given its mass, he built a collapsible canvas screen around the entire hull, supported by rubber air tubes that displaced enough water to keep the tank afloat using the same principle that keeps a ship afloat: hull volume versus weight. The screen stood roughly 1.5 meters above the deck, effectively turning the Sherman into something resembling a peculiar coracle with a tank hidden inside it. Crews described the sensation of driving one as similar to sitting inside a canvas bathtub balanced on top of 30 tons of steel, with the waterline sitting disconcertingly close to the top edge of the screen in anything but the calmest conditions. Propulsion came from 2 small propellers mounted at the rear, driven off the tank's own engine through a secondary set of gears, the duplex drive that gave the vehicle its name, meaning the crew could switch between propeller drive for swimming and normal track drive for movement on land. Top speed in the water was a modest 6 kilometers per hour, roughly the pace of a brisk walk, which meant every minute spent swimming was a minute spent as a slow, low, barely armed target with no meaningful means of self-defense beyond the machine gun poking through the canvas. Steering was managed through a small propeller-mounted rudder, controlled by the driver using an extended tiller bar, an arrangement that gave the tank roughly the maneuverability of a loaded barge in a crosswind. Once the tank reached shallow water or touched sand, the crew released a lever that dropped the canvas screen flat around the hull in seconds. The propellers were disengaged, and the tank simply drove forward on its tracks as though nothing unusual had happened at all, its main gun ready to fire within moments. When it worked, the effect on the enemy was reported to be one of genuine bewilderment. Tanks appearing to rise directly out of the sea onto the beach with no warning and no visible means of transport. The DD Sherman was only one invention among many produced under Hobart's command, but it was arguably the most audacious. Other funnies solved comparatively conventional problems: flails to detonate mines ahead of the tracks, bridging vehicles to cross anti-tank ditches, flame-throwing tanks to clear bunkers at close range. None of those required a tank to temporarily become a different category of object altogether. The DD conversion demanded that crews trust a few hundred square feet of rubberized canvas, no thicker than a heavy tent, to keep the sea itself at bay while 30 tons of steel sat almost entirely below the waterline. Naval architects consulted on the project reportedly treated the brief with some skepticism at first, since every principle of small boat design argues against building something so heavy, so top-loaded, and so unforgiving of a single tier or a single wave breaking over the freeboard. Strausler's answer was to keep the design as simple as possible, minimizing the number of components that could fail under stress, because a complicated mechanism was a mechanism with more ways to drown a crew. Production of the DD conversion kits took place primarily at facilities in Britain associated with the wider 79th Armored Division. Program: adapting standard Sherman M4A2 and M4A4 hulls already being supplied in large numbers under Lend-Lease arrangements. Exact production figures remain somewhat imprecise in the public record, a consequence of wartime classification and the fact that DD kits were fitted to existing tanks rather than built as an entirely separate production line. But historians generally estimate that several hundred Sherman tanks were converted to DD configuration in the build-up to Operation Overlord, distributed among British, Canadian, and American armored units training specifically for the amphibious role. Training for DD crews was, by all accounts, its own kind of ordeal. Men who had joined the Armored Corps to drive tanks found themselves practicing escape drills in flooded tanks at training establishments, learning to exit through the turret hatch while submerged, wearing basic breathing apparatus in case the canvas screen collapsed or the tank foundered in open water. Several men drowned during training exercises in Britain before the invasion had even begun, a grim preview of what deep water could do to a vehicle that was, at its core, still a tank pretending to be a boat. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. On the morning of the invasion, the DD tanks were assigned to swim ashore ahead of or alongside the first waves of infantry across the 5 invasion beaches, but the sea conditions that morning were considerably worse than the calm water in which the tanks had trained and been tested. At Omaha Beach, naval commanders made the decision to launch the DD tanks much closer to shore than originally planned, a choice that proved decisive. Of the 32 tanks launched for Utah, the overwhelming majority reached the Seine successfully, arriving just ahead of the infantry and providing immediate direct fire support against German positions, precisely as the concept had promised. At Omaha Beach, the outcome was catastrophically different, and it stands as the defining tragedy of the DD tank's combat history. There, commanders launched the tanks from roughly 5 to 6 kilometers offshore, in far rougher water than at Utah, judging that conditions were survivable when in practice they were not. Of 32 DD tanks launched for the American 741st Tank Battalion in the Omaha sector, 27 sank before reaching the beach, swamped by waves breaking over the top of their canvas screens, dragging men down inside steel hulls from which escape was desperately difficult. Many crews drowned. The infantry who landed on Omaha in those first waves did so largely without the armored support the entire concept had been built to provide, one of several compounding factors that made Omaha the bloodiest sector of the entire invasion. At Gold, Juno, and Sword, results fell somewhere between these extremes, with a mixture of successful swims, tanks launched directly onto the beach by more cautious commanders who judged the sea state too dangerous, and losses along the way. Records of the exact number of men lost specifically to DD tank sinkings remain incomplete, folded as they are into the broader casualty figures of the day, but survivor accounts from the 741st describe men clinging to the rubber tubes of collapsed screens, watching tanks slip beneath the surface within seconds once water breached the canvas, with almost no time to escape through a single turret hatch. Germany never fielded an equivalent system. German amphibious armor research in the 1930s, associated with early plans for a cross-channel invasion of Britain that never materialized, had experimented with waterproofed and even submersible tanks intended to drive along the seabed using a snorkel, a fundamentally different and arguably more dangerous approach that was never tested under combat conditions. By 1944, with Germany fighting a defensive war, There was no operational requirement for amphibious armor, and no German equivalent to the DD Sherman existed on any invasion beach. The Americans, for their part, adopted the DD concept directly from the British program, rather than developing a rival system, fitting the Straussler screen to their own Sherman hulls and training their own crews through the same 79th Armored Division framework, which is why American units suffered the Omaha losses using British-designed equipment. In that sense, there was no real transatlantic competition, only a single British invention, adopted wholesale by an ally, that performed brilliantly in one sector and catastrophically in another, separated only by sea state and the judgment of the officers deciding when to launch. Assessing the actual impact of the duplex drive Sherman requires holding two truths at once. At Utah Beach, the concept worked, essentially as designed, and the presence of armor in the first wave is credited by many historians as a meaningful factor in the comparatively light casualties suffered there. At Omaha, the same concept, applied in worse conditions and launched too far from shore, contributed directly to one of the costliest mornings in American military history, stripping the first wave of the armored support it desperately needed at the exact moment it needed it most. The tank did not fail as a piece of engineering so much as it failed as a decision, a judgment call about sea conditions made under pressure with incomplete information on a morning when the English Channel simply refused to cooperate with the plan. In the decades since, historians and military analysts have returned repeatedly to the decision-making of that single morning at Omaha, not to assign blame so much as to understand how a well-tested system could fail so completely under a combination of pressures that no training exercise had fully replicated. Sea state on the 6th of June was worse than forecast. The launch distance chosen by naval commanders in the Omaha sector was considerably greater than at Utah, a decision driven by the need to keep landing craft outside the range of German coastal batteries, a perfectly reasonable calculation on its own terms that nonetheless multiplied the exposure of the DD tanks to open water. Some accounts suggest that a handful of tank commanders in the Omaha sector, faced with visibly deteriorating conditions, considered requesting a closer launch and were unable to communicate that judgment up the chain in time, or were overruled by the schedule of an invasion that could not simply pause to wait for calmer water. What is certain is that the same equipment, the same crews, the same doctrine, produced wildly different outcomes across a coastline barely 50 kilometers wide, purely as a function of how far offshore the order was given to launch. The legacy of the DD tank endures in less obvious ways than a straightforward battlefield triumph. It represents one of the more remarkable engineering improvisations of the war, proof that a committee of engineers under wartime pressure could take an existing 30-ton battle tank and, through nothing more exotic than canvas, rubber, and a spare set of propellers, turn it briefly into a boat. Surviving examples can today be seen at the Tank Museum in Bovington, England, and at various D-Day memorial sites and museums across Normandy. Canvas screens usually displayed extended, so visitors can appreciate just how thin, how fragile that barrier between tank and ocean truly was. The lessons learned from Omaha about sea state, launch distance, and the narrow margins for error in amphibious armor fed directly into how later Allied planners approached subsequent landings in the Pacific and elsewhere, where amphibious tanks and vehicles were employed with considerably more caution about when and where to commit them to open water. Picture it again. 6 kilometers offshore, dawn breaking over a gray and furious sea, 32 tanks disguised as boats easing down ramps into water they were never quite meant to survive. Some of those tanks reached the beach and turned the tide of battle in their sector within minutes of arrival. Others simply vanished beneath the waves, taking their crews with them, victims not of enemy fire but of an ocean that had not read the plan. That contradiction sits at the heart of the duplex drive Sherman story. It was an act of extraordinary engineering ingenuity, built in desperate haste to solve a problem no army had ever fully solved before, the problem of putting a tank on a beach the instant infantry needed it there. And it was, on its worst morning, A lesson in how thin the margin can be between a brilliant idea and a fatal one. A margin measured not in meters of steel but in centimeters of canvas, standing between a swimming tank and the bottom of the sea. 27 tanks lost at Omaha, 32 launched at Utah, and most of them walked ashore exactly as intended. 2 beaches, 1 invention, 2 entirely different fates, decided by waves that did not care how clever the engineering was. The Sherman DD was built to make the impossible ordinary, a tank that could swim to war. For some of the men who rode inside those canvas screens on the 6th of June 1944, it did exactly that. For others, it became the last vehicle they ever sat in, sinking silently into a sea that had never been part of the plan at all.